In this roundup of the week, another shooting in America unleashes another round of riots, but are the protesters President Trump's best hope of re-election? The UK gets hot under the collar over the BBC's plans to cancel the song Land of Hope and Glory, and the UK's disastrous wheat harvest has eco-doomers predicting the beginning of the end. My name's Mallen Baker, this is the Mallen Baker Show for Changemakers. Welcome back to the fiery but mostly peaceful year that is 2020. And what a week it's been, especially fiery whilst also being exceptionally peaceful. I mean, seriously, some importantly bad things have been happening this week, but you can't easily get past the heights of absurdity in how the mainstream media in the US is trying to fit the reality into its election year messages. CNN attracted special derision with this screenshot that went viral on social media, with its reporter standing in front of the fires of rioting in Kenosha, Wisconsin. The protests and riots came after another police incident took place with one Jacob Blake, who was resisting arrest and apparently reaching into his car when an officer shot him 7 times in the back. The exact details of what happened still aren't clear and are subject to an investigation. Blake reportedly had a warrant out for his arrest, and when he resisted, officers apparently tried to tase him, but that didn't stop him. For lack of clarity didn't stop the media, protesters and politicians declaring that this was yet another example of senseless police brutality targeted specifically at black people. This is now the normalised reality of the moment, one that seems not to be reflected by any reality described by actual data, but which is nevertheless held to be self-evidently true because of the way the media focus on each single event, amplifying it to the detriment of any other shootings and events if they don't fit the same template. And that means good people horrified at what seems to be happening, very understandably feeling the need to take a stand. Like, for instance, Naomi Osaka, the tennis player, whose decision to pull out of her match of the New York lead-up to the US Open prompted the tournament to pause play for a day. And this was just one of several sporting events that did likewise. Osaka and other tennis players are just good people taking what they're told on trust. They're not amongst the political virtue signallers that get criticised for bringing politics into the sport on a routine and habitual basis. They're just seeing things that they're told are due to brutal police racism, and entirely correctly, they're saying that brutal police racism is unacceptable. Meanwhile, other people responded in the way that is becoming traditional. Looting, burning places, destroying people's businesses, beating up unconnected people, and generally engaging in other, mostly peaceful activities. It's almost as though Black Lives Matter have come out for the re-election of Donald Trump and are following a carefully laid strategy to maximise his chances. On numerous occasions, I've highlighted on this channel how much damage leaderless campaign movements generally do to their own cause, especially when they behave like a mob, which is what can happen in the absence of leadership. Case in point, this week, while the Trump show was going on elsewhere, with speaker after speaker pointing at violence, rioting and mob rule, in DC, groups of Black Lives Matter protesters descended upon a number of restaurants and ordered the diners to raise their arms in a BLM fist salute. When one woman, Lauren Victor, refused to do so, they surrounded her and yelled in her face. This is what that looked like. Afterwards, it turned out that Victor actually supports the movement and had been on marches, but didn't think it felt right that people should be coerced to show support. She showed significant presence of mind and dignity in the face of a bunch of people behaving like bullies. She was prepared to stand up against something when everyone around her thought it was okay. BLM, if you need some genuine leadership to stop you doing dumb, counterproductive stuff, you should look towards people like Lauren Victor, because she clearly has it. it being understanding of what processes are appropriate to achieve change, the courage to stand up for what you believe, even when surrounded by a haranguing, intimidating crowd of people demanding that you conform. Those aren't the only things that make a great leader, but they're certainly a fantastic starting point. Unfortunately, there are consequences when people feel that their communities are being abandoned to the rioters and the looters. And we had a tragic example of that this week when we saw 2 people shot dead and somebody up for murder who probably shouldn't be. Now, you have to remember, I'm a Brit. Here, you don't have to be a lefty to think that citizens wandering around with assault rifles is something we generally assume could end badly. The UK is influenced by the US in many ways, but nobody here is campaigning for a UK Second Amendment equivalent. So I find it hard to comprehend. Not that America allows people to own guns. I have no real problems with that. It's a historical thing. Some people believe strongly in it. Fine. Some consequences come with that, but every country establishes its culture and makes its choices. But I find it hard to comprehend that at demonstrations that have been prone to turning into riots, it's a fine thing to have people wandering around with guns and assault rifles. One of those, in this case, was Kyle Rittenhouse, a 17-year-old young man who came with a group apparently to defend a gas station from being attacked by rioters. You can imagine, and the evidence suggests, that he and his colleagues meant well and just wanted to show that they wouldn't put up with the attacks that had been taking place. Which is fine, but good intentions aren't in themselves an excuse. You are responsible for the consequences of your actions, and if you turn up to a place of high tension carrying lethal weapons, you don't have to be a genius to see where that is going to end up. What happened to start the fatal incident isn't clear. According to one report, Rittenhouse got into an argument with some protesters who had started a fire. In the end, he was apparently chased into a used car lot by protesters. There was the sound of another gunshot that was heard from someone else unknown before he turned toward the sound of that gunfire as one of his pursuers was lunging for him from the same direction. Rittenhouse then fired 4 times and apparently shot the man in the head. He was then chased by several other people and he stumbled and fell. A guy came at him with a skateboard and he shot him dead. And then shot another who had a gun in his hand, shot him in the arm. Rittenhouse has been charged with first-degree murder, which, given the circumstances, I find odd because he clearly seems to have acted in self-defense. In Wisconsin, first-degree intentional murder is categorized as causing the death of another human being with intent to kill that person. You can defend against that by arguing self-defense. It's mitigated to second-degree intentional murder in the case of unnecessary defensive force. If a person believed he or another was in imminent danger of death or great bodily harm, and that force was used was necessary to defend the endangered person if either belief was unreasonable. He certainly acted disproportionately, and the deaths are a tragic and senseless loss of life. He should be charged appropriately, but it's hard to see how a first-degree murder charge is going to stick. The men who were killed were Joseph Rosenbaum and Anthony Huber. Their friends testified to their peaceful nature and how they wouldn't go out just looking to beat people up. That said, it seems they both had convictions for violent offences in the past. I don't know if that's been officially confirmed. They didn't look that peaceful in the videos. No doubt none of them deserved to die, and I suspect nor did this teenager deserve to have his life ruined. But you know what? None of this is a game. You riot and you loot and you destroy businesses and livelihoods. People will fight to protect those things. You chase after people, they may well fight back. And if the police aren't going to enforce the law robustly and professionally, then stupidity is going to get people killed. Nothing justifies it. Nothing excuses it. But these are the consequences of the political forces running amok in the United States right now. And the human lives lost or ruined are the collateral damage of that political struggle. So this week was the Republican National Convention to launch the Trump re-election campaign. And unlike the Democrats the previous week, there was much discussion of the rioting and looting in various cities. And you can frame the heart of this battle like this. The Democrats' case to the American people is that the riots and the violence is part and parcel of the aberration of the Trump administration. They don't condemn the rioters. Instead, they suggest that these people are just responding to the racism and injustice that comes from the government. And therefore, of course, if Joe Biden is elected, then all of this will naturally end. The Republicans, on the other hand, are pointing out that these riots are political, not genuine protests against injustice, and that they are tolerated and even encouraged by Democrat states, and this is a sign of what is to come if Joe Biden is elected.
Your vote will decide whether we protect law-abiding Americans or whether we give free rein to violent anarchists and agitators and criminals who threaten our citizens.
Both parties are mindful of how that narrative plays out, could be decisive in the increasingly short period of time before the election. There's been some evidence so far that the Democrats' framing has been initially successful, with Trump's handling of both COVID and the aftermath of George Floyd's death leading to an eroding of his support. But this week, with the convention, which by all accounts did a pretty good job of showcasing a diverse range of support, and the continuing relentless chaos of riots, that may have started to change. Not only did the latest polls suggest that Joe Biden's poll lead is tightening, but CNN's Don Lemon suggested that polling was now suggesting that the ongoing violent chaos was starting to swing people towards the Trump campaign. That reflects that there's only so far you can keep pretending such things are not happening before it begins to backfire on you, because it seems as though you don't care that it's happening. Whitney Cabal, a Black Lives Matter leader in Kenosha, said the city is not going to stop burning itself down until protesters know that this officer has been fired. But people do know that cities don't burn themselves. And at some point you have to acknowledge which human beings with agency are making the decision to burn down people's businesses. They can't keep hiding behind a label saying mostly peaceful. And if they try to, that may well be the thing that sinks them. Now, another city that didn't burn itself, that I've spoken about quite a bit, is Beirut. Interestingly, this week, my attention was drawn to an old document that's been on Wikileaks for some time, dating from around 2010. This came from an internal email from an American global intelligence company, Stratfor. So this was sent years before the Rosas even set sail. Hezbollah searches for an alternative explosive. A Stratfor source in Lebanon has reported that Hezbollah is having difficulty obtaining military-grade explosives such as C4 and RDX from foreign sources, forcing it into greater reliance on external supplies of ammonium nitrate, found in common fertilizer. The source says the sealing of the Lebanese coastline by the UN interim force in Lebanon and Syria's increasing efforts to cut off Hezbollah's supply of these explosives in a bid to rein in the organisation explain the shortage. According to the source, Hezbollah pays Syria twice the market price for fertilizer, a common ingredient in ammonium nitrate-based improvised explosive devices, IEDs, and has bought up to 15,000 tonnes of fertilizer from Syria's main petrochemical facility in Homs. Syria then takes the profits and buys cheaper fertilizer from Eastern Europe for its domestic needs. This reportedly explains Hezbollah's insistence that one of its members be agriculture minister when Lebanese Prime Minister Saad al-Hariri was forming his cabinet in 2009. Agriculture Minister Hossein Haj Hassan allegedly sells fertilizer shipments from Syria to Hezbollah agents who in turn forward them to Hezbollah warehouses. Again, this is circumstantial evidence, not proof of Hezbollah's involvement in the stockpiling of the ammonium nitrate that caused the explosion. But that circumstantial evidence certainly seems to be piling up. Now, unfortunately, none of my contacts in Beirut seem filled with a great deal of hope that there will be justice, or that there will be a new government that isn't simply dominated by the same gangsters that have been in charge for the last couple of decades. So, how about some light relief instead? A culture war that everybody takes totally seriously and yet nobody dies. Both Britain and France have been engaged in a moment of outrage this week over challenges to their cherished cultural values. You can decide for yourself what it says about each country if I tell you that in Britain, the trigger was the initial decision by the BBC to drop the singing of Land of Hope and Glory and Rule Britannia from the last night of the proms. In France, it was the actions of police to tell women that they couldn't sunbathe topless on the beach. The BBC proms are an annual series of live classical music events, the last night of which is always a bit over the top. But apparently for the woke-aware BBC, the words of Rule Britannia had suddenly become problematic in the statue-toppling world that we now live in. For instance, the words Rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves, Britons never, never, never will be slaves. I thought not being slaves was a good thing, but I'm obviously missing something. Anyway, there's been an uproar, and it made newspaper front pages, and yet another strike against the BBC for being obsessed with wokeness. And you might think, but this is dumb, it's a TV show, who cares? Mallen, why are you wasting our time with this stuff? But it's simply to note the power of symbols, particularly when it comes to national symbols. After all, what is a nation at all, except a group of people who decide to share the same mythology? National identity, justice, honour, the rule of law, these are things that we invented, because otherwise it wouldn't be possible to live together as a large community. Changing the nature of the myths that you collectively believe, it's really the thing that people fight the most passionately about. Most revolutions don't materially improve the lives of the people that take part in them, they change the story they tell about who they are. And that's what the riots are about in America. And in this case, the woke revolution is about fragmenting identities and a moralising puritanism, whether by accident or design. Identifying with a nation is out. You instead have to identify with your group, based on your skin colour, your gender, your sexual orientation. And these things make headlines because they are no longer trivial challenges. They start with telling people not to use certain words and end in riots. In that sense, the last night of the proms row and the burning streets of America are two ends of the same process. Trevor Phillips, the former chair of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, wrote that instead of cancelling songs from the last night of the proms, they should instead pick up the report launched this week by the Education Policy Institute, which showed that black Caribbean children leave British schools a full year behind their peers educationally. Anyone who really thinks Black Lives Matter, he said, should put down their placards and pick up the EPI report, read it thoroughly and ask themselves, what can I do to help? And then open your mind to possibilities that may not make you feel more virtuous, but could tackle the racial turmoil roiling our nation. That sounds rather similar to things that I often end up saying to the climate change campaigners, who believe that gluing themselves to a building or throwing paint on the floor is the most productive thing you can do to address a global environmental issue. I had yet another exchange of this sort on Twitter this week, responding to an XR activist who was suggesting that the group was the most effective agent for change in this area so far. Recognise that the general election prior to the formation of XR saw no mentions of a climate emergency or crisis, whereas the GE after included the language it used by XR in the manifestos of Labour, the Lib Dems, the Greens and the Conservatives. Woohoo! So people are now using the rather lame climate emergency phrase. Really? That's all you've got to show for all the disruption that's been caused to date? I pointed out that the government was already committed to net zero carbon before XR came along, which is based on action, not words. Maybe he should reflect on how that came to be, since action might be even more useful than symbolic statements. There are plenty of practical things people can be doing if they want to make things better. Oh yeah, he said, name one. I said, well, it depends. Do you want policy, disruptive entrepreneurs, corporate sustainability execs, scientists and ecologists, engineers, civil servants, advisors, communications professionals, marketers, or delivery program NGOs? Well, it turns out he was only really interested in anyone that had taken his line on the imminence of human extinction. which, given that that notion is wholly unscientific, does serve to narrow the pool somewhat. Mind you, there's been a few more doomsters than usual this week, thanks to news of the imminent catastrophic food shortage. It was reported this week that the UK's wheat harvest has been hit hard by recent weather extremes, meaning it's something like 40% down. That's the result of two extremes back to back, such as an extensively wet period with lots of flooding in the winter, followed by months of hot drought in the spring. This has been reflected across the EU, with wheat production expected to be down, although by less than 10% rather than the heavier drop in the UK. As a result, some Extinction Rebellion types have been pointing to the drop as supporting their predictions of imminent doom. But worldwide, the grain harvest is expected to be at a record level. While wheat has been down in Europe as well as in North America, it's up in Russia, Argentina, Australia and Canada. Still expected to be slightly down on last year's record level. What about corn? After all, 10 million acres of corn in Iowa were destroyed. World production of corn is up by 4.4%, the most significant factor that will drive world cereal production to those record levels, alongside rice, which will be 1.6% up. Iowa notwithstanding, the US delivered a record corn harvest, along with Canada, Ukraine, and with near record harvests in Brazil and Argentina. And all of that in spite of the pandemic. Bad weather has been hitting farmers forever. Global food production and effective international trade makes us more resilient to the impact of that bad weather than ever before. Now, it doesn't make us invulnerable to everything. Don't take it as a call for complacency. But people, particularly young people, don't always entirely understand what the process is when we say that climate change may increase incidences of extreme weather. So, for instance, the heavy thunderstorms and high winds of the last few days in the UK have been attributed to climate change. We're not going to get into the uncertainties or otherwise of attribution here, but for a lot of people that means that they think this is unprecedented weather for an August. It's meant to be high summer after all. But of course it's not unprecedented at all. Indeed, a violent summer storm helped defeat the Spanish Armada in 1588. More recently, in 1952, violent rainstorms killed 34 people. In 1956, thunderstorms left streets several feet thick in hailstones. In 1979, a Force 11 storm killed 15 in the Fastnet yacht race disaster. If climate change does indeed result in more frequent events such as these, it's just that. Making more frequent something that has always happened, and which we're more resilient in the face of than we've ever been before. Stating that isn't downplaying anything, it's just putting things into perspective. Now, more vulnerable to all of this is China, which has the smallest amount of agricultural land per head of population than any similar country. The heavy rains and floods of the last month or two have been having a heavy toll there, as is evidenced by Xi Jinping's calls for restaurants and citizens to avoid wasting food. It's not clear whether there's actually a shortage. The South China Morning Post said that farmers were hoarding grain in the expectation of higher prices and supply interruptions because of its conflict with the US. The official statistics, meanwhile, say that grain harvests have been higher than ever. Mind you, that's kind of what they were saying at the height of Mao's Great Famine, where 30 to 40 million of people died from starvation. China can afford to buy food, and it's expected to increase, for instance, its purchase of wheat on the global market from 4 to 6 million tonnes. But at a time when it's projecting itself as a world leader, fighting aggressively with some on the world stage, making a show of its magnanimity in distributing PPE, even to America, probably doesn't want to be seen as struggling in such a key area. Either way, none of it just yet foretells the end of days that some would have you believe. The point is that every year, certain regions of the world will get poorer than usual conditions. People will always be able to point at those areas and use them to stoke fear. There's no room for complacency, and we should expect years where the global totals do get hit, compared to the current record totals. It's just always worth stepping back from the local problems to look at the bigger global picture to see what is actually happening. And it's always worth challenging unscientific claims. Apparently, an Extinction Rebellion film narrated by Keira Knightley, Climate Crisis and Why We Should Panic, has been amended to remove two apocalyptic claims that were criticised by climate scientists as being wholly unsupported by the evidence. Those were 1, that human extinction is a real possibility, and 2, that climate breakdown is already killing 400,000 people every year. I'm waiting to hear that they've changed the title to Climate Change and Why We Should Be Appropriately Concerned. Not quite as sexy, I know. The trouble is that few people get to hear those rebuttals, and in the meantime, many young people particularly heard the original claims and simply accept them as true. Alistair McIntosh, author of a new climate change book called Riders of the Storm, pitched in on the increasing phenomenon of extreme alarmist activism. He is no climate skeptic, but he had this to say. Alarmism feeds upon the natural fears and decent trust of the understandably uninformed. It allows the enemies of climate action to paint climate science as the domain of wacky prophets and their followers who have to keep on revising upwards their forecast date of doomsday. It draws those who have been caught up in such thinking into the cognitive dissonance reduction of looking for, and in a strange way maybe even hoping, that the signs on which they have staked so much are being fulfilled. And I see that element in all the extreme campaigners we've been talking about. The adrenaline rush of the big crisis can be pretty addictive. The topics under discussion this week mean that this video will not be monetized, so I need to extend my thanks as always to the good people who support this channel on Patreon. Their support enables me to make these videos talking about the issues that are most interesting regardless of whether YouTube advertisers want to go anywhere near them. If you would like to join those wonderful people and would like to support the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content that this channel aims to provide, please go to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. And please note that Patreon takes contributions at the start of the month, regardless of when you sign up. It takes one when you sign up and then one at the start of the month. So being as we're nearly at the end of the month, if you would like to sign up but don't want to be hit twice in quick succession, you might want to delay signing up until after the 1st of September. By the way, a few of you have noticed already, but something else happened this week. It's a minor milestone, but thanks to all of those who have offered encouragement and good wishes for the growth and success of the channel. All of it is very much appreciated. Have a great week. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show.